So I want to tell you, if you don't already know, that we have some pretty amazing volunteers in our church office. Two of them are Shar Reinhardt and Barb Fedosic. So on Thursday of this past week, Barb was in the office unpacking some of the things that we brought with us from the downtown office up here when we relocated our offices up here. And I happened to be in the office when Barb came across this. Now, she kind of looked at it, and so did I, and wondered, what in the world is that? And Barb said something like, it kind of looks like a surgical instrument of some kind. And Shar Reinhardt said, well, actually, that is a staple remover. And I think Barb Fedosic and I thought exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. I think we thought, no, this is a staple remover. But Shar was pretty consistent, and she was right. I'm going on record with that. Shar was right. This is, in fact, a staple remover. And now that we know what it is, we know what to do with it. Once you know what something is, what to do with it becomes more apparent, right? So, has there ever been a time in your life, you ever looked at something and thought to yourself, what is that? Like maybe a tool that you've never seen before, or maybe a piece of technology that you're not sure what it is, or maybe it's a food that you've never tried before, or maybe it's a plant that you'd like to put in the ground but you've never seen it before and you're not quite sure how, or maybe you find yourself in a brand new set of circumstances that you've never been in before. And you ask yourself in every one of those instances, what is that? And once you come to be aware of what that thing is, what's the tool for? What does the technology do? Maybe you try the food and it's either a yum or a ick. And you try it and you come to an awareness of what that thing is. And once you do that, then you become aware of what to do with it next. Okay? So, in the past few weeks, Jesus has been teaching us kind of indirectly about what is prayer. He's been helping us understand the answer to that question. So far, he's given us two answers to what is prayer. First, he said, prayer is worship. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. To hallow God's name is to hold God's name holy. And remember that when we're talking about the name of somebody, it's a representation of the whole person. There are multiple people in this room that's named David. But when the Jan's name is attached to the name David, it refers to me and everything about me. When you hold God's name holy, you are holding all of God holy. And that's the call from Jesus, to hold all of God holy. Holding God's name holy is an act of worship. To revere God's name, that's what the word hallow means. To revere the name of God is an act of worship. And anytime you and I hold God's name holy in our priorities, in our relationships, in the way that we engage the world, anytime we hold God's name holy, we are praying. We are worshiping. Prayer is worship. And then last week, he talked about the fact that prayer is submission. It's this moment-by-moment choice that you and I make to let our lives be governed by God's heart and God's design and God's desire for our life. To be governed by God is to choose to live in a way that allows God's heart and purpose and design to rule in our lives. No matter what the weather, might happen to be in our lives. We've had everything this week in terms of weather, haven't we? I mean, there's been snow, right? There's been sunny skies. There have been mornings when it's been in the 30s, and there have been days when it's been in the 70s. We've had everything this week. To let your life be governed by God's priorities is to say that I'm going to let God rule in my life no matter what the weather is. In the joyful moments and in the moments where it's kind of stormy in our lives. So Jesus says, first, understand what prayer is. Prayer is worship and prayer is submission. Now, just like it was with the stapler, once you know what it is, then you can become more aware of what to do with it. And that's where Jesus goes next. Once you know that prayer is worship and submission, here's what to pray for. Here's how to pray. And Jesus starts with this. Give us today our daily bread. Would you say the word today? Would you say it, all of you, now? Today. Give us today our daily bread. So to hold God holy, to invite Him to govern our lives, means that we are going to trust Him to provide for us. That's what daily bread means. It means this necessary, sufficient resources that we need for this particular moment in our lives. Now, that's certainly not the way we tend to operate, right? We tend to always be thinking about tomorrow, don't we? I mean, my bride started to think about what Sunday dinner would be on Tuesday of this week, right? We're always thinking about tomorrow. We're always thinking about what's going to happen next week or where we want to be next year. And I'm not saying any of that's bad. I'm saying that what Jesus is talking about is live your life day by day, trusting that God is going to give you what you need for this moment, for today. It really, daily bread isn't about what I might need next week. It's about what I need this particular moment. And see, if God cares for us today, then we can trust that God is going to care for us tomorrow. Whatever tomorrow is going to look like. Friends, the best way to prevent anxiety in your life and mine is to trust God day by day. And to trust that He will give us exactly what we need. There's this great story in Exodus chapter 16. I need to set the stage a little bit for the story. Some of you who have read the book of Exodus know that the people of God spent over 400 years as slaves in a country called Egypt. And when the time is right, God decided to set His people free from Egypt so that they could travel through the desert to a mountain called Sinai where He could tell them what He wanted them to be. So to get that to happen, He sends this guy named Moses. And Moses gets it so that the people get free from Egypt, and then they watch God do some incredible things, some miraculous things. You might remember they come to the edge of a sea called the Red Sea, and the Egyptians are hot on their tail. And God parts the Red Sea, and they walk through it on dry ground, and then the sea drowns all of their pursuers. They travel a day or so into the wilderness, and they get thirsty, and they start to grumble against Moses. Now, none of you do that. Nobody grumbles in here, right? They grumble against Moses. And what happens? Moses is directed to strike a rock and water comes out of it. And the water needs to be purified in some instances. And God takes care of that and makes sure that it's clean and healthy for the people to drink. Miraculous thing. They travel a little further into the wilderness toward Mount Sinai. And all of the food they brought with them from Egypt is gone. And they get hungry. And so God says through Moses, tell the people that I will rain down bread from heaven on them, called manna. Here's the thing. God put some stipulations or some boundaries around that manna. He said, here's what you need to do. I want you to go out and I want you to gather manna every morning, but only gather enough for your family for that day. Would you say today? Today. Gather only enough for today. If you try to gather more, and if you keep it overnight, trying to ration it, it's not going to be good for you. Some of the people didn't listen to Moses, and they tried to keep some of it for the next day. And when they got up in the morning, it was smelly and full of maggots. God said, gather only enough for you and your family for one day. Go out early in the morning, because if you miss it, when the sun comes up, it's going to melt away. On the 6th day, gather enough for 2 days, God said to the people. Because the 7th day is a Sabbath day. A day, watch this, to hold God holy. Gather enough on the 6th day for your family for 2 days. It won't go bad, and the people did, and it didn't. Except there was that same group of people who decided they're not going to listen to God, and they went out on the 7th day to gather manna, and there wasn't any there. Right? So what's God trying to teach them through this story? Same thing that Jesus is trying to teach us. Learn to trust God day by day. Don't worry about tomorrow. So Jesus says, give us today our daily bread. Here's the challenge, though. Holding God holy, asking Him to govern our lives, means that we pray and we seek Him and we trust Him for what we need every day. It means that we're going to live life God-dependent. Say that with me. God-dependent. God-dependent today. The word, think about that word, dependent, for just a minute. It shows up in a whole lot of different places in our lives, right? We claim dependence on our taxes, don't we? And we want our children and our grandchildren to grow up to be independent. One of the powerful images for the church in the New Testament is interdependence, where the gifts that I have connect with the gifts that you have, and together we become the church. We are dependent, interly, on each other. But here's the thing. Each of those understandings of dependence is human. And it's kind of subject to human frailties and human tendencies, right? Whenever we have something, we tend to want to control it. And so what God teaches us is daily bread. God teaches us to trust Him daily, to be God-dependent. I was thinking about that. What does it look like? What does it look like in life to be God-dependent? I started to look at my own life. I thought, I tend to be a worrier. Do I have any fellow worriers in the room with me today? Yeah, I can get caught up in that sometimes. But if I'm living a God-dependent life, here's what it means. It means that the earth and everything in it is God's. Right? It's not Washington, D.C. It doesn't matter what happens in Washington, D.C. Doesn't matter what happens in Moscow. Doesn't matter what happens with Hamas and Israel. None of that ultimately matters, because everything in the world belongs to God. It's all God's. And that means that I can live my life ultimately at peace about what's going to happen, because God's got it. I don't have to give my life to worry and to anxiousness. I can give it instead to God and let God use my life for His purpose. What about relationships? What does it mean to live God-dependent for the relationships that are in our lives? Somebody told me a long, long time ago, talk to God about your spouse or about your children or about your coworker or about your neighbor. Talk to God about that person before you talk to your neighbor or your spouse or your child or your coworker. You get the image? God-dependent. Talk to God about the people in your life before you engage the people in your life. God-dependent relationship. How many of you at some point in time in your life in this place have tried to lose weight? Okay, most of us have our hands up. How many of you at some point in time have tried to improve your life in some way or another? Think about that. What does God-dependent have to do with improving our life? Think about all the how-to books that are out there right now, right? How to raise kids, how to stay married for life, how to get along with other people in life. There's all kinds of how-to books. Any of those books, any of those resources can be used by God to improve our life. But here's the thing, start with God. Don't listen to what anybody else tells you about the book. Ask God, what are the resources that I need for the improvements in my life that I believe you want me to make? God-dependent living. See, Jesus challenges us to recognize that prayer has everything to do with trusting that God has all the resources that you and I need for every day. But here's the thing, God's heart is relationship with us. More than anything, God wants to be in relationship with us. And so what does God do? God gives the resources we need a day at a time. Because He knows if He gives more than that, our tendency is to control the resources and manipulate the resources for our own good. Can I get a witness? You know what I'm talking about. God gives it a day at a time. Because He knows if He gives us more than that, we're going to just put God off to the side and control things ourselves until the next crisis comes along. And then we'll re-engage God. So He calls us to live life God-dependent. In our relationships and in the way we engage the world. When we're trying to be better people. God calls us to live God-dependent. I want to introduce you to somebody. I want to introduce you to a guy named George Mueller. I have a professional coach, a life coach, spiritual director. His name is Graham Standish. And Graham did a little paper about George Mueller that really kind of helps you understand something about who he was. I want to read a couple of paragraphs from this so that you can get a sense of who George Mueller was before I tell you a story about George Mueller. So George Mueller was born in Prussia in 1805. If you were to look at his childhood, you would never dream that George Mueller would become one of the spiritual giants of the 19th century. You would never think about that. Because his childhood and his adolescence were spent mainly seeing what he could get away with and getting into trouble for the things he couldn't get away with. Right? As a child, watch this, he started to steal money from his father, who was an accountant and tax collector for the Prussian government. And his life of trouble grew from there. Even when he was caught stealing or misbehaving, he didn't think about how wrong he was to do the things he was doing. Instead, his thoughts turned to how he would be more clever so he wouldn't get caught the next time. So his dad was kind of frustrated. And so he sent him to religious school, hoping that maybe it would kind of straighten him out, maybe even set him on the path to be a pastor. The only things that he excelled about in that school were chasing women, drinking, gambling, and manipulating others. At times, he really wanted to change his life, but he'd slip back into his old ways. And this pattern of drinking and partying continued after he graduated from school and enrolled in the university. As much fun as he is having drinking and partying, deep in his heart, he knew that this was not the life that God wanted for him. He kept on trying to change, even wanted to change. But he slipped back into the partying ways over and over and over again. Interestingly, it was in a bar one night that the seeds of his life change were planted. He was there one night, drinking. A friend of his he remembered from grade school named Beta walked in. They hadn't been really good friends during high school, but they struck up this friendship around alcohol that night. And they decided that they would spend the summer touring Europe and seeing how many bars they could get into in the course of one summer. When they did that, they came back, and Beta started attending some meetings that changed his life. And he said to George Mueller, I've been attending a meeting at the home of a Christian, and I've been meeting some new people. We read the Bible and we pray and we sing, and somebody normally reads a sermon. And Beta said to George Mueller, would you come and join me at this next meeting? Well, George Mueller could say, yeah, I don't think so. But the more Beta talked about this, and the more George saw the life change in Beta's life, the more George said, okay, I'll give it a try. I think I'll give it a try. And it was at that meeting that God invited George Mueller to join his team for the rest of his life. George Mueller did become a pastor. He did become a missionary. And he became known as this person that lived his life by radical trust and faith in God. There would be many times that he would be to the very end of his resources, and somebody would drop by and give him exactly what he needed for that particular moment. The fall of 1835, here's the story. Fall of 1835, he was walking around the streets of Bristol, England, and all he saw was kids. Kind of like the kids ran over there. Kids running everywhere. They were orphans. George said, somebody should do something about this. Why are these kids running around everywhere? Somebody should do something about this. And that night, God laid it on his heart that he should open an orphanage for these kids. But George said, if I do that, I'm going to do it under some specific stipulations. And here's the first stipulation. I will never ask somebody else for money to run the orphanage. It will be an orphanage that is run completely based upon prayer and faith and trust in God. And the second stipulation is every boy or girl that comes into this orphanage, if it's a boy, he will have 3 suits of clothes. If it's a gal, she will have 5 dresses. Each child will have 2 pairs of shoes. Each child will have a bed, a cubby, 3 square meals a day. They will get outside and have fun. They will work. They will learn to read and write, which, by the way, in the middle of the 19th century, you didn't do that for orphans. But that's what George Mueller wanted to do. And remember, he's trusting God to provide this. So he opened the orphanage in the early part of 1836. By the time May of that year rolled around, he had 30 girls. Can you imagine that? 30 girls. Shortly after that, boys started to come. They were in a house in a working class neighborhood of Bristol. And when they outgrew the house, George prayed and another house became available and they moved. And when they outgrew that one, another house became available and they moved. And it would happen over and over and over again like that. Now that's not to say it was easy. Somewhere between 1838 and 1846, George writes in his journals that those were really hard times. There were some mornings when they would finish breakfast and there would be absolutely no food and no money for lunch. And so they would pray. Somebody would open the mail and there would be the money needed to buy lunch. One time in particular, George says, we finished breakfast, there was nothing for lunch, we went to prayer, and a knock came on the door. It was the village baker. And the village baker said to George Mueller, I just had a sense that I was supposed to bake bread for all of the orphans today. So he did. And the baker wasn't any more than around the corner until another knock came at the door. And it was the village milkman. The milkman said to George Mueller, my cart just broke down at the end of your driveway. In order for me to get it fixed, I'm going to have to unload the milk and the butter from the cart. And by the time I get it fixed, the milk and the butter will be spoiled. Can you use this at your orphanage today? And George says that happened over and over and over again. And by the way, I'm not making this up. It's on public record in England. You can read it if you want. By the time George Mueller died in 1898, the orphanage had 2,050 children and was located on a campus, wrong button, was located on a campus of 25 acres. It's still there today. This is the George Mueller Orphanage. It's run by the City College of Bristol, England now. It's still there. I think this quote kind of sums up his life. I set about the work for the glory of God, that there might be visible proof by God supplying in answer to prayer only the necessities of the orphans, and that He is the living God and most willing even in our day to answer prayer. God-dependent living. That's pretty radical. But what would it mean for your life to not worry so much about tomorrow and to simply focus on the God who promises to give you what you need today. A few years ago, I was attending a conference in Atlanta, Georgia. I flew down to Atlanta on a Tuesday and was flying home on a Saturday, I believe. And the flight coming home was late in the afternoon into the early evening, and it was stormy in Atlanta that night. I remember getting onto the plane, and I could see the sheets of rain coming, and it was overcast and dark, and I could hear the thunder rumbling. Stepped onto the plane, and as the plane took off, it wasn't a matter of seconds until we were engulfed in clouds. Have you ever been in that kind of situation before? Been on a plane and you just climb right up into the clouds, and there's just nothing around you but clouds. And it just seemed to me that it wasn't long until we were climbing up out of the clouds, and this is what I saw out my window of the plane. Now get that. You climb into the clouds, and then you climb out of them to a place where there is sunshine and there is blue sky and there are white clouds around you. And I realized at that particular minute that God was saying something to me, so I grabbed my journal, and this is what I wrote. This is the effect of prayerful trust in God's provision. It allows us to soar above the storms and reminds us of the one that we belong to. I was not the same when we descended back into the clouds in Pittsburgh that day. I was a different person. The flight reminded me that my reality is not overcast and storms. My reality is depending on the one who's got me. Day by day by day. No matter what the weather might be. Even in the midst of the storms. Does that God have you? Is that your reality?